Of the many strange documents that have passed across the table at Baker Street in the years of my association with Sherlock Holmes, I do not think any puzzled me quite so completely on first sight as a small sheet of paper covered in a line of dancing stick figures. Holmes had been seated for some hours in silence, his long thin back curved over a chemical vessel in which he was brewing something that filled the room with a distinctly unpleasant smell. His head was sunk on his chest, and from where I sat he looked like some strange, lank bird, grey feathers and a black topknot, entirely still except for the occasional adjustment of a retort. I had picked up the newspaper and settled into my own chair, thinking myself quite unobserved. "So, Watson," Holmes said suddenly, without lifting his eyes from his work, "you do not propose to invest in South African securities?" I gave a start of genuine astonishment. I had made up my mind on that exact question only that morning, and had mentioned it to no one, Holmes least of all. He allowed himself a small, satisfied smile at my expression, and then, before I could ask, walked me through it. He said he had noticed the groove of chalk between my left forefinger and thumb when I came in from the club the night before, the mark a man gets from steadying his cue at billiards. He knew I only played billiards with Thurston. He recalled that I had told him some 4 weeks earlier that Thurston held an option on a South African goldfield that was due to expire within the month, and had asked whether I wished to go in with him on it. My checkbook, he pointed out, was locked in his drawer, and I had not once asked him for the key, from all of which he concluded I had decided against the investment. "How absurdly simple," I said. "Quite so," said he, a little nettled by my tone. "Every problem becomes very childish once it has been explained to you. Here is one that has not yet been explained. See what you make of it." He tossed a single sheet of paper onto the table between us and turned back to his chemistry. I picked it up. It was a page torn from a notebook, the markings done in pencil, and it took me a moment to understand what I was looking at. A line of small figures, drawn with the awkward proportions of a child's hand, arms and legs flung out in a dozen different postures. Some appeared to be dancing. A few held small flags aloft in one raised hand. They marched across the page in a single determined row, and there was nothing else on the sheet at all. No letter, no explanation. "Why, Holmes," I said, "it is a child's drawing." "That is what Mr. Hilton Cubitt of Ridlingthorpe Manor, Norfolk, is very anxious to know," Holmes said. "This came by the first post this morning, and he is to follow by the next train. There is a ring at the bell now, Watson. I should not be surprised if that is him." A heavy step sounded on the stairs, and a moment later, a tall, ruddy, clean-shaven gentleman was shown into the room, a man whose clear eyes and weathered cheeks spoke of a life lived well away from London fog. He seemed to carry some of his own bracing East Coast air in with him. He shook hands with each of us in turn, and was on the point of sitting down when his eye fell on the paper still lying on the table. "Well, Mr. Holmes," he said, "what do you make of these? I was told you were fond of a queer mystery, and I don't believe you'll find a queerer one than that. I sent it ahead so you'd have time with it before I arrived." Holmes said it was certainly a curious production, and that at first glance it appeared to be nothing more than some childish prank, a handful of absurd little figures dancing across a page. He asked why Cubitt attributed any importance to something so apparently trivial. "I never should, Mr. Holmes," Cubitt said, "but my wife does. It is frightening her to death. She says nothing about it, but I can see the terror in her eyes, and that is why I have come to sift this to the bottom." Holmes asked him to begin at the beginning, for my benefit as well as his own, and to leave nothing out, however small it seemed. Cubitt settled himself into the chair with the careful, nervous movements of a man unused to telling long stories, clasping and unclasping his large hands as he spoke. He was, he told us, the last of an old Norfolk family that had held the same land at Ridlingthorpe for 5 centuries. No rich family, but a well-known one in the county. The year before, he had come up to London for the Jubilee and had taken a room in a boarding house in Russell Square, chosen because Parker, the vicar of his own parish back home, happened to be staying there at the same time. Among the other lodgers was a young American woman named Elsie Patrick. Some acquaintance grew between them, and before his month in London was out, he was, in his own words, as much in love as a man could be. They were married quietly at a registry office and returned to Norfolk as husband and wife. He said he knew how it must sound, a man of an old family marrying in such a fashion, knowing next to nothing of his wife's history or her people, but he said that if we had met her ourselves, it would make a good deal more sense to us than it could on his account alone. Before the wedding, he said, she had been entirely honest with him about the shape of the bargain, if not its contents. She told him she had had some very disagreeable associations earlier in her life, that she wished to leave them behind entirely, and that if he married her, he would be marrying a woman who had nothing she was personally ashamed of, but that he would have to take her word for that and allow her silence on everything that had come before the day she became his. If those terms were too hard, she told him, he should return to Norfolk and leave her to the life in which he had found her. He had told her he was content to take her on those terms, and he had, he said, been as good as his word. They had been married a year, and it had been, by his account, an entirely happy one, without the smallest cloud between them, until about a month before, near the end of June, when he first noticed signs of trouble. Holmes interrupted at this point to ask what those signs had been. Cubitt said that his wife had received a letter from America. He had seen the American stamp on the envelope. She had gone deadly white reading it, and had thrown it straight into the fire without a word of explanation. He had made no allusion to it since, holding to his promise. But he said she had not known an easy hour from that day forward. There was always, he said, a look on her face now, as though she were waiting for something, expecting it. Then, about a week before he came to London, on the Tuesday, he had found a number of the same absurd little dancing figures scrawled in chalk on one of the windowsills. He assumed at first it was the stable boy's doing, though the boy denied all knowledge of it when asked. The marks had clearly been made overnight. Cubitt had them washed off and thought little more of it until he mentioned the matter to his wife afterward. To his surprise, she took it with the greatest seriousness and asked him to make sure she saw any others that appeared. None came for a week. Then, the previous morning, he had found this very paper lying on the sundial in the garden. He had shown it to Elsie. She dropped in a dead faint on the spot. Since then, he said, she had gone about the house like a woman half in a dream, dazed, with that same terror never far from her eyes. It was not a matter he could take to the local police, who would only have laughed at him, so he had written to Holmes instead, and sent the paper on ahead of himself. Holmes had listened to the entire account without once interrupting, his eyes closed, his fingertips pressed together in the attitude I had come to recognize as his way of building a structure as mind, piece by piece, as new information arrived. When Cubitt finished, Holmes sat in silence for a moment longer before speaking. "Don't you think, Mr. Cubitt," he said at last, "that your best course would be to make a direct appeal to your wife and ask her to share the secret with you herself?" Hilton Cubitt shook his large head slowly. "A promise is a promise, Mr. Holmes," he said. "If Elsie wished to tell me, she would. It is not for me to force her confidence, but I am within my rights to take my own line to protect her, and that is exactly what I intend to do. It's getting on my nerves, this business," he said, sinking back into the chair like a man suddenly much wearied. It is bad enough to feel you are surrounded by some unseen, unknown party with a design upon you. But when you know, on top of that, that it is killing your wife by inches in front of your own eyes, it becomes as much as a man can bear. Holmes reached for the paper again, turned it over once more in the light from the window, and then folded it carefully and placed it in his pocketbook. "This promises to be a most interesting and unusual case," he said quietly, "and I do not think, Mr. Cubitt, that we have a great deal of time to waste in getting to the bottom of it." Holmes asked whether Cubitt had noticed any strangers in the neighborhood. Cubitt said he had not, and that it was a very quiet place. Any fresh face would draw comment in the village itself, he admitted, though there were few small watering places not far off, and the local farmers did occasionally take in lodgers. Holmes said the figures clearly had a meaning of some kind. If the meaning was purely arbitrary, invented fresh for this purpose alone, it might prove impossible to solve. But if it followed some system, some underlying logic that had been used before, he had no doubt it could eventually be broken. The trouble, he said, was that this single sample was far too short to work with, and the surrounding facts too indefinite to build an investigation on. His advice was that Cubitt return to Norfolk, keep a close watch, and take an exact copy of any fresh figures that appeared. It was, he added, a great pity they had no copy of the ones found earlier on the windowsill. He also asked Cubitt to make quiet inquiries about any strangers in the district. When there was fresh evidence to work with, he should come back to Baker Street, and Holmes would give the matter his full attention and would come down to Norfolk himself without hesitation if anything pressing developed in the meantime. Cubitt thanked him and left that same afternoon, and for several days afterward, I noticed Holmes taking the folded paper from his notebook at odd moments and studying it with a long, searching attention, though he made no further comment on the case. Then, roughly a fortnight later, I was on my way out one afternoon when he called me back. "You had better stay here, Watson," he said. I asked why. "Because I had a wire from Hilton Cubitt this morning," he said. "You remember him? The dancing men business. He was due at Liverpool Street at 1:20, and I gather from the wording of his telegram that there have been some new developments of real importance." We had not long to wait. Cubitt came straight from the station by hansom, and when he was shown in, I saw at once that the past fortnight had not been kind to him. His eyes were tired, his forehead lined in a way it had not been before, and there was a weight on him that had nothing to do with the drive. He told his story without much preamble. "The very morning after his first visit to us," he said, "a fresh set of the dancing figures had appeared, chalked this time on the black wooden door of the tool house, which stood beside the lawn in plain view of the front windows. He had taken an exact copy before rubbing the marks away, and he produced it now and laid it on the table." "Excellent," Holmes said. "Excellent. Please continue." "2 mornings after that," Cubitt said, "another inscription had appeared, and he had a copy of that one as well. Then, 3 days later, a further message had been left, scrawled on paper this time, and tucked beneath a pebble on the sundial, the characters identical to the one before it. At that point, he said, he had decided to lie in wait. He took his revolver and sat up through the night in his study, which looked out over the lawn and garden. It must have been close to 2 a.m, the whole grounds dark except for moonlight, when he heard footsteps behind him and found his wife standing there in her dressing gown. She begged him to come to bed. He told her plainly that he intended to find out who was playing these tricks on them. She insisted it was nothing more than some senseless practical joke, and that he ought to pay it no attention at all. She even suggested, if it truly troubled him so much, that the two of them simply go away and travel for a while, to avoid the whole nuisance entirely. He had refused outright. He was not going to be driven out of his own house by a practical joker, he told her. The whole county would have a fine laugh at his expense. She had asked him to at least come to bed and discuss it properly in the morning. And then, As she was speaking, he saw her face go whiter still in the moonlight and felt her hand close hard on his shoulder. Something was moving in the shadow by the tool house. A low, dark shape came creeping around the corner and settled down in front of the door. He seized his pistol and made to rush out at once, but his wife threw both arms around him and held him back with a strength he had not known she possessed. He tried to break free of her. She clung on. By the time he finally got loose, crossed the room, and reached the grounds outside, the figure was gone. There was no trace of the man anywhere, though he searched the whole property. But the fellow had left something behind him after all, because when Cubitt examined the tool house door again the following morning, there was a fresh line of dancing figures scrawled beneath the ones already there. Holmes leaned forward sharply at this. "Tell me," he said, and I could see the interest sparking behind his eyes. "Was this new line simply added on beneath the first, or did it appear as something separate?" "It was on a different panel of the door," Cubitt said. "Excellent," Holmes said again, with real feeling this time. "This is by far the most important detail you have given me yet. It fills me with hope. Please, go on." Cubitt said there was little more to tell, except that he had been genuinely angry with his wife that night for holding him back when he might otherwise have caught the man in the act. She told him afterward that she had been afraid he would come to harm. For one uncomfortable moment, he admitted, it had crossed his mind that perhaps what she truly feared was that the other man might come to harm, since he could no longer doubt that she knew perfectly well who this figure was and what these strange signals meant. But he said there was something in his wife's voice and in her eyes that made doubt impossible, and he remained certain it was genuinely his own safety she had been afraid for. That, he said, was the whole of it, and he wanted to know what Holmes thought he ought to do. His own instinct was to station half a dozen of his farm hands in the shrubbery and give the fellow such a beating the next time he showed himself that he would trouble them no further. Holmes said he feared this was too deep a matter for so simple a remedy, and asked how long Cubitt was able to stay in London. Cubitt said he had to return that same day. He would not leave his wife alone through another night for anything in the world. She was in a nervous state and had begged him to come straight back. Holmes said he thought that was probably the right decision, though he added that if Cubitt could have stayed even a day or two longer, he might have been able to travel down to Norfolk with him directly. As it was, he asked Cubitt to leave the papers in his keeping and said he believed it very likely he would be able to visit shortly and bring some real light to bear on the matter. Holmes kept his composure until Cubitt had gone, but I had known him long enough by then to see the excitement working beneath the surface. The instant our visitor's broad back had disappeared through the door, Holmes was across the room, spreading every scrap of dancing men paper across the table, and threw himself into a dense, intricate calculation. For 2 full hours I watched him cover sheet after sheet with rows of figures and letters, entirely lost to the room around him. At times he made visible progress and hummed some tune under his breath. At other times he sat motionless for long stretches, brow furrowed, eyes fixed on nothing at all. Finally, he came up out of his chair with a short cry of satisfaction, paced the room, rubbing his hands together, and sat down to write out a long telegram on a cable phone. "If the answer to this comes back the way I expect," he told me, "you will have a very pretty case indeed to add to your collection, Watson. I believe we shall be able to go down to Norfolk tomorrow and bring our friend some very definite news about the source of his trouble, Empire." I was consumed with curiosity, but I knew Holmes well enough to leave him to his own timing, and so I waited. The answering telegram was delayed, and 2 restless days passed, during which Holmes seemed to prick up his ears at every ring of the bell. On the evening of the second day, a letter arrived instead, from Hilton Cubitt. All was quiet at Riddlingthorpe, he wrote, except that a long new inscription had appeared that very morning on the pedestal of the sundial. He had enclosed a copy. Holmes bent over the paper for several minutes in complete silence. Then he came up out of his chair with a sudden exclamation, something between surprise and dismay, his face gone haggard with anxiety. "We have let this affair run on far too long," he said. "Is there a train to North Walsham tonight?" I checked the timetable. The last one had already gone. "Then we breakfast early and take the first train in the morning," he said. "Our presence is needed there urgently, and I do not intend to waste another hour." A moment later, Mrs. Hudson brought up the cablegram he had been waiting for. He tore it open, read it once, and set it down without any visible relief. "That is exactly as I expected," he said quietly, "and it makes it all the more essential that we lose no further time in letting Hilton Cubitt know precisely what he is caught up in. It is a singular web, Watson, and a dangerous one, and our simple Norfolk squire is tangled somewhere near its very center." Riddlingthorpe Manor came to view through a grove of old trees, two brick and timber gables catching the last of the daylight, and as our carriage drew up to the porticoed front door, I recognized, beside the tennis lawn, the black tool house and the pedestaled sundial that had featured so strangely in everything Cubitt had told us. A dapper little man with a quick, alert manner and a waxed mustache had just stepped down from a hired dog cart. He introduced himself as Inspector Martin of the Norfolk Constabulary, and seemed considerably startled to learn the identity of my companion. "Why, Mr. Holmes," he said, "the crime was only committed at 3 this morning. How could word have reached you in London in time to be here as soon as I am?" "I anticipated it," Holmes said quietly. "I came in the hope of preventing it." The inspector's astonishment deepened, but he had the good sense not to press the point. He told us the two women, the housemaid Saunders and the cook Mrs. King, had raised the alarm, and that they were currently in the kitchen. Holmes said he would like to hear their account directly, and that he had, for his part, only the evidence of the dancing men, which he would explain in full once matters here were settled. He asked whether the inspector wished to associate him formally with the investigation or would prefer he work independently. Martin said he would be proud to have Holmes's assistance, and meant it. The two women's account was clear and consistent. They had been woken by an explosion, followed a minute later by a second. They had run down together and found the study door open, a candle burning on the table, their master lying face down in the center of the room, already dead. His wife was crouched near the window, terribly wounded, blood on the side of her face, breathing but unable to speak. The passage and the room were thick with smoke and the smell of gunpowder. The window, both women insisted, had been shut and fastened from the inside. There had never, to their knowledge, been the smallest quarrel between husband and wife. They had always been thought the most devoted couple in the county. The old country surgeon reported that Mrs. Cubitt's wound, though serious, was not necessarily fatal, the bullet having passed through the front of her brain. Whether she had been shot or had shot herself, he would not venture to say. Cubitt himself had been shot cleanly through the heart from the front and had died instantly. Only one revolver had been found in the room. On the floor midway between them, two of its chambers emptied. Holmes examined the body first, noting the absence of any powder marks on Cubitt's dressing gown or hands, and observing that the lack of such marks meant little on its own, since a revolver in good repair might leave no trace at all. Then he turned to detail that seemed, at first, almost trivial. He asked whether the candle on the table had guttered. It had not. This told him, he explained, that the window and door of the room could only have stood open for a very short time that night, since a longer draught would have caused the flame to run. But the powder smell had reached the servants immediately on the top floor the moment they left their rooms. A draft was needed to carry it that far, that fast, which meant, however briefly, the window had been opened at the moment of firing. He crossed to the window and began to search the frame with his lens. Within a minute, he had found what he was looking for. A bullet hole drilled clean through the lower sash, about an inch above the sill. It suggested, he said, a third person standing outside the glass, and a shot fired toward that position from within the room, one that had missed and struck the frame instead. He led us out into the garden. A flower bed ran up beneath the study window, trampled flat, printed all over with the marks of a man's boots, large, with a peculiarly long and pointed toe. Holmes went over the ground on his hands and knees like a hound working a scent, and after several minutes gave a short cry of satisfaction and lifted a small brass cartridge case from the grass. A revolver with a self-ejecting mechanism, he said, which told him something specific about the weapon and about the man who had carried it. He had by then all but completed his reconstruction, though he did not share every conclusion at once. Instead, he wrote out a short note in a curious straggling hand quite unlike his own, addressed it to a Mr. Abe Slaney at Elridge's farm, East Ruston, and sent the stable boy off with strict instructions to answer no questions from anyone he passed on the road. He told the household staff that if any visitor arrived asking after Mrs. Cubitt's condition, they were to be given no information whatsoever, and shown directly into the drawing room. Then, with an hour or two still to fill before we could know what the note would bring, Holmes finally laid out every scrap of dancing men evidence across the table and explained, for the benefit of the inspector and myself, exactly how he had broken the cipher. The method, once explained, had the same maddening simplicity that all his methods eventually acquired. The first message he had ever seen was short, but the letter E, he reminded us, is by far the most common in English, and 4 of the 15 symbols in that first sample had repeated themselves, giving him E with reasonable confidence. Some of the figures carried small flags, which he took to be word breaks rather than part of the code itself. From there it became a matter of ordinary cryptographic patience, watching for common short words, common letter combinations, and testing each guess against the growing body of text as new messages arrived. A repeated string of symbols ending 3 separate messages with 2 E's spaced 3 letters apart had suggested the name Elsie, and from there L, S, and I fell into place. A 4-letter word ending in E appearing just before that name each time could only reasonably be come, with C, O, and M established. An early message resolved into a fragment reading roughly am here, Abe Slaney, which gave him the letters A, H, R, and N as well, and confirmed something important. Slaney, he said, was almost certainly American, since Abe was a distinctly American shortening, and a letter from America had started the whole affair. He had cabled a contact at the New York police, a man named Wilson Hargreave who had helped him before, asking simply whether the name Abe Slaney meant anything. The answer had come back within a day. Slaney was, in Hargreave's words, the most dangerous crook in Chicago. The final message, deciphered with the alphabet now largely complete, had read as a threat, telling Elsie to prepare herself to meet her fate. It was that message, arriving in London the same evening as Hargreave's warning, that had sent Holmes rushing for the last train, and it was the missed connection that had cost us the hours that mattered. Inspector Martin listened to all of this with open admiration, his earlier wariness gone entirely. Holmes said there was no more mystery to make of it, and that we would shortly have our answer in person, because unless he was very much mistaken, the gentleman himself was even now walking up the drive. We took up positions just inside the door. Holmes told the inspector to have his handcuffs ready and to leave the talking to him. The wait that followed was one of those minutes I have never been able to forget. Then the door opened, and a man stepped through it. Tall, dark, handsome, in a hard sort of way. A black beard, a great hooked nose, a grey flannel suit, and a Panama hat, swinging a cane with the easy swagger of a man who believed the place already belonged to him. Holmes had a pistol against his head before he had taken a second step. Martin had the cuffs on his wrists a moment later. It was over almost before he understood he had been caught. He glared between us with two blazing black eyes, and then, astonishingly, laughed, a short, bitter sound. "Well, gentlemen," he said, "you've got the drop on me. I came here on a letter from Mrs. Cubitt. Don't tell me she had a hand in setting this trap." Holmes told him, without any softening, that Mrs. Cubitt had been gravely injured and was not expected to live. The man's whole face changed. He gave a hoarse, ragged cry that carried through the house and demanded to know how that could be true, insisting it had been the husband who was hurt, not her, that he would never have touched a hair on her head, that we did not understand what she meant to him. He sank onto the settee with his manacled hands over his face and sat in silence for what felt like a long time. When he raised his head again, it was with the strange cold composure of a man who has stopped fighting. He told us everything. He had known Elsie, he said, since she was a child. Her father, a man everyone called Old Patrick, had run a gang of 7 in Chicago, and it was Patrick himself who had invented the Dancing Men Code, a private trade cipher that would pass to any outside eye as nothing more than a child's scribble. Elsie had grown up inside that world and had never been able to stomach it. She had a little honest money of her own, and one day she simply left, came to London, and built an entirely new life. She had been promised to him once, he said, would likely have married him if he had ever chosen a different profession, but she wanted no part of anything crooked, then or ever. He had traced her to Norfolk only after her marriage, when a mutual acquaintance let something slip. He wrote. She never answered. So he crossed the Atlantic himself, took a room at Elridge's farm where he could come and go at night unseen, and began leaving his messages where she alone would understand them. He knew she read them, because once she had written a reply chalked beneath one of his. When persuasion failed, his temper got the better of him, and the messages turned to threats. She had written to him at last, begging him to leave, telling him it would destroy her husband if any scandal touched their name, and offering to meet him at 3 in the morning at the study window, alone, if he would agree to go afterward and leave her in peace forever. She came down that night with money, hoping to buy him off. He said the sight of it, the attempt to simply pay him away like a debt, was what finally broke something in him. He caught her arm through the open window and tried to pull her out toward him. That was the moment her husband burst into the room with his revolver already in hand. Cubitt fired first, he said, and missed. Slaney fired back and did not. He said he turned and ran across the garden the instant Cubitt went down, and that as he went he heard the window slam shut behind him. That, he told us, was every word of it, God's honest truth, and he had heard nothing more until the stable boy came riding up that afternoon with a note that walked him straight into our hands like a fool. Holmes told him, in a voice I had rarely heard him use, that Elsie had fled from him precisely because of the man he was, that she had crossed an ocean to escape him and had built an honest life with a man she respected, that his pursuit, his threats, and his messages had ended in the death of a decent husband and had driven his wife, in her grief, to turn the second bullet on herself. Slaney's shoulders dropped entirely at that. He said, quietly, that if Elsie died, he did not much care what became of him. Then a flash of suspicion crossed his face, and he demanded to know how anyone but Elsie herself could possibly have written the note that had summoned him there, since no one outside their old Chicago circle knew the code. What one man can invent, Holmes told him, another can learn to read. Inspector Martin gave the formal caution as the cab arrived outside, two uniformed constables waiting within it. Slaney asked, before they took him out, whether he might see her. He was told she had not regained consciousness. He offered no more resistance. As the cab pulled away down the drive, Martin turned to Holmes and said, with real warmth, that he hoped, if ever he had another case worth the name, he would have the good fortune to have Holmes beside him again. I noticed, after the cab had gone, a small, crumpled ball of paper still lying on the table where Slaney had tossed it during his outburst. It was the decoy note. "See if you can read, Watson," Holmes said, with the first real smile I had seen on him since we left London. I could not, of course. It was nothing but a short line of dancing figures. "Using the same code," Holmes said. "It says only this: come here at once." I knew he would not refuse an invitation he believed could only have come from her. And so, my dear fellow, we have finally turned the dancing men to some good, after everything they had already been made to do in the service of Han. There is only this to add. Abe Slaney was sentenced to death at the Winter Assizes in Norwich, a sentence later commuted to penal servitude, in consideration of the fact that Hilton Cubitt had, beyond any doubt, fired the first shot. Of Mrs. Hilton Cubitt, I know only what reached us afterward, that she recovered fully in time, that she never remarried, and that she gave the remainder of her life to the care of the poor and to the quiet management of the estate her husband had left her.